So, welcome everyone. I'm Mary Beth Brangan of the Ecological Options Network, and we're delighted to see you all here today. This is such an important topic, and we want everyone to know the truth about the harmfulness of radioactivity. Um, we are going to be sending out the recording link afterwards to all registrants. So don't worry about that if you miss something. Um, we have an impressive lineup of speakers, as you know, and they'll be sharing the latest understandings of radioactivity, um, despite the fact that uh, our government in the United States is pulling out all the stops to remove any hindrances to having a build out of the nuclear facilities that they want. And they're pushing in every country, I understand. So we're so delighted to have participants in our Transatlantic nuclear-free alliance, and we hope that more will be joining um, as we share information that will help us all in our individual struggles to stop this. Um, I'm going to introduce Richard Outram, who is the co-founder of um, the Transatlantic Nuclear Free Alliance. He's the former secretary, and Richard was the former secretary for many years of the nuclear free local authorities in the UK and Ireland. And now he's the secretary of the Welsh nuclear free local authorities. Richard has a degree, first class honors degree in international relations and security studies from the Peace Studies Department of the University of Bradford. He has over 20 years' experience as a local government officer with a, opposing nuclear waste in its many manifestations. He's based in Manchester, UK. Welcome, Richard.
Okay, thank you, Mary Beth, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I can see we've got a significant audience. I'm confident that the audience is from both sides of the Atlantic, so that's wonderful. That's the aim of this group. As Mary Beth says, I'm actually currently engaged with the Welsh Anti-Nuclear Alliance, which is a coalition body of about 10 anti-nuclear non-government organisations in Wales, which is currently part of the United Kingdom. As a result of the current Labour government's proposals, we now face threats of small modular reactors on the island of Anglesey in northwest Wales, and also from micro reactors from a company called Last Energy, which American colleagues might be familiar with. Um, yes, I have had 20 years experience in local government, but I should say that I've actually just retired recently. So I'm working on a voluntary basis for the Welsh Anti-Nuclear Alliance. I've just been asked to say a few words about the Transatlantic Nuclear Free Alliance, how it came about, what its aims are. So I'm delighted to do that. Essentially, it was brought about as an expression of international solidarity between activists on both sides of the Atlantic. Initially, it comprised Canadian and UK activists who were opposed to the prospect of a deep repository being established in our respective countries for high level nuclear waste and the concerns that community activists had about that process. And we had a whole series of meetings concerning issues around that general theme. And then it kind of morphed on from that, in that I came into contact with Mary Beth and colleagues in order to show the San Onofre film about the impact of nuclear waste as a result of the abandonment of a nuclear power station in California. And we had a whole series of film events, several of which were actually in Wales. And we decided from that between us to establish the Transatlantic Nuclear Free Alliance. So essentially, it's a coalition of people across both sides of the Atlantic in Canada, the US, UK, France, and other countries concerned about nuclear waste, nuclear power, nuclear weapons issues. And we decided to develop this forum in order to allow us to explore issues of common interest and common concern, bringing a perspective from each of our respective nations in order to share knowledge, experience, and to be honest, solidarity and support as well in our respective campaigns. So this is kind of the first webinar that we've arranged under that banner, and I'm proud that it's been co-sponsored by Welsh Anti-Nuclear Alliance. So we are planning other webinars in the near future. No doubt details will be supplied later on, but we are looking to have a webinar around the links between civil and military nuclear industries and weapons in July, and also later in the year, around in November, around the perils of reprocessing, with which we're very familiar in the United Kingdom. And we also plan to have a webinar at some point with Linda Pence Gunter around the recent book No to Nuclear that she's launched. So I'd just like to thank you all for being here with us today for this event. Very much welcome your ideas and input. If you'd like to know more about the Transatlantic Nuclear Free Alliance or about the Welsh Anti-Nuclear Alliance, please pop something in the chat with your email and I'll make sure to come back to you. And certainly we'd like to keep you informed about any future webinars and events in the hope that you'd want to join us there as well. So thank you and do have a very good event.
Thank you so much, Richard. We're so grateful to be working with you. Um, I wanted to now introduce Eric Epstein. Eric is an American activist and nuclear watchdog known for leading the 3 Mile Island Alert, a Pennsylvania-based citizens organization dedicated to monitoring radiation releases from nuclear facilities and for advocating for safe energy alternatives. He's chairman of the group, has been a prominent critic of nuclear power in all of Pennsylvania, and particularly in relation to 3 Mile Island. And he's spoken out and taken heroic efforts to oppose the restart of Unit 1 in 3 Mile Island. He's based in Pennsylvania, USA. Welcome, Eric. And the 47th anniversary of the meltdown at 3 Mile Island is Saturday.
Right. Probably be acknowledged Friday night, 4 o'clock at the north gate of the island. I'm Eric Epstein, not to be confused with the other Epstein, and wanted to give a brief overview of markers in terms of radiation release and health effects from 3 Mile Island. I mean, the first thing to know is that at the time of the accident, the filters were clogged, the monitors went off stack, and what monitors remained didn't have the ability to pick up radiation release. So we were operating from the 1984 report by Dr. Jan B.A. And I can share this with folks, yeah, or just I'll share it and somebody can distribute it. So the President's Commission thought that maybe and postulated 15 million Curies got out. Dr. B.A. had a much higher estimate, as did Dave Lochbaum and Arnie Gunderson. And I think fundamentally to understand 3 Mile Island radiation and health, you have to know that we've been lowballed. And so we have provided empirical evidence. Dr. B.A. going back to 1984, where I think we've established that exposure was anywhere from 276 millirem to 63,000. So the other problem is that what has not been acknowledged is that people experienced exposure to radiation, eye irritation, diarrhea, excuse me, vomiting, and a number of health effects over and over again. And this has been documented in the Katagiri study. So that's kind of like our baseline, which is no baseline. It's fluid. And wanted to point out some very important radiation exposure milestones after that. So after the accident, June, July, the company basically had to, or said they had to vent. They vented 43,000 curies of krypton. That was in June. It was found to be illegal in September, which was not much help to us. But the first major study that documented increased cancer was the American Journal of Public Health. It was our secretary at the time, Gordon MacLeod, and he convincingly, and again, we have this in our packet, the neonatal mortality rate within 10 miles of TMI experienced about a four-time a jump from 78 to 79. Gordon MacLeod was fired. We still have the report, but that was the first kind of peg in the sand. There were other, if you saw the movie Meltdown, what wasn't brought out in that movie is that there was another illegal release of radioactive gases. But the penultimate study that the industry rests its case on was the 1985 Department of Health study. And unfortunately or unfortunately, they looked at 31,000 cases. However, they manipulated the data. And this is really important because this data was the cornerstone that all the other pro-nuclear studies were rested were based on. So that study was dismissed by epidemiologists at Harvard and Penn State. The population dose was deleted or diluted rather. And following that, we had a slew of studies on psychological stress, which is something we don't really talk about, but obviously we talk about it, other folks not so much. I also want to point out something that was a big deal for us back in '84. We had a guy named Bill Pencil. He was a worker at the plant. They refused to allow him to wear a respirator. And I think what a lot of people may not be familiar with the 1900 suits, many of those suits were from workers and journalists who covered the accident. Also, uh, again, you can take it for what it's worth. There were about $84 million in health and economic claims settlement. The largest was for a baby born with Down syndrome. So the Pittsburgh study, which is often, it's a Talbot study. It's often referred to by the industry, was based on the Pennsylvania Department of Health study. So again, the study by Evelyn, and I talked with her, it hasn't gone so well. And like every study that's found increased cancer, just a reluctance to link it to TMI. And she even recommended we need follow-up studies on leukemia among men. But if you look at the Columbia study, you're going to find statistically significant relationship between incident rates after the accident in the residential proximity to the plant. Now, that was the study that Dr. Wing built his study upon. I don't know if that's the right way to put it. And Dr. Wing basically concluded that the local residents inhaled radionuclide contamination that caused significant amounts of different cancers. And we have a map of that, which we can share with folks. So I know that's a lot to discharge, but the postscript, if there is one, is all going back to, I think it was maybe even as early as 95, we started finding increased thyroid cancer. So we had studies, Roger Levine, from 95 to 2002. And so we found increased thyroid in 2017, 2019, and we're doing another, Hershey Medical's doing another thyroid study. This is significant not just because of the thyroid, which is the point of the study. Penn State Hershey is extremely conservative. And when I met with these folks and they wanted to do the study, you can tell they wanted to find no cancer. So I think, again, this is really compressed. We have definitively found increased cancer. We have definitively interviewed. There's been 5 different surveys where we've gone door to door and where the people have reported the impact of being exposed to radiation. So, one of the things I do when I'm interviewed and people say, hey, yeah, nobody died at TMI, and every study found this. I said, name one study. I've yet to find anybody that's pro-nuclear that can identify a study. So, look, I'll share this with folks because there's a lot more there, and we put it in chronological level, and happy to answer questions later.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Do you want to say anything about the 3 Mile Island reopening push?
Well, as you alluded, we don't track all Pennsylvania plants. We track all the plants on the Susquehanna River. So, yes, we have a commemoration coming up, but we are just cramped with litigation. And since we monitor the plant north of us, which is Susquehanna, which has a data center contract with Amazon, and the plant south of us, which is Peach Bottom, which we're in court with, really not a lot of energy to do anything on the 47th anniversary. We're going to get together, for a dinner, a potluck, which seems to be the signature meal for anti-nuclear activists around here. And it's also code for just way too much potato salad. But at any rate, we just have interviews. I think my last interview is a podcast with, I'll get the man's name, Malcolm Gladwell or God, I forget what the gentleman's name is. So it kind of exhausted. The litigation is here, and look, happy to speak to that. But we are litigating in three different places: NRC, DEP, and the SRBC.
Mm. Thank you so much, Eric, for your work. And people are asking for the list of any studies you think are worthwhile.
I can send it, Mary, to you or to whomever. I have that, and I have the TMI health map. So I'm technologically challenged, as are the operators of 3 Mile Island, but I'll send to you what we have.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Thank you, thank you. All right, I don't know what that noise is. Can people hear that? Or is it just me? Um, Something from Microsoft came up on my screen.
I don't hear anything, Mary Beth. This is Mary.
Okay, thank you. Um, I will then go ahead and, oh, it's driving me crazy. All right. The next person to speak, by the way, I want to mention to everybody that the link to watch the Women of 3 Mile Island will be in the chat for people. Heidi Hutner, the producer director, has graciously donated the link to it. Now I want to introduce Mary Olson. She's the founder and the CEO of Generational Radiation Impact Project, GRIP. She founded it to work on clarifying the impacts of ionizing radiation on human health and society. She was raised and educated as an evolutionary biologist. And prior to founding GRIP, she served as staff biologist at the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, and radioactive waste policy analyst until 2019, and then director of the Southeast office of NIRS starting in 1999. She's applied her concern for future generations, serving as educator, policy advocate, and ally for communities impacted by nuclear waste and other nuclear sites. She's based in North Carolina, USA. Welcome, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Alliance for this opportunity to speak. And let's see, let me get my view so it makes sense to me. All right. I'm going to share screen because I have slides, and people may be a little concerned that I'm going fast, so I'm definitely going to share the slides with the Alliance and they can post them out to people. We
Yes,
changed
I
the
can.
name. Good. We changed the name of the organization this year, and we have a different URL. So if you're familiar to our old one, it will still forward, but our new one is radiationproject.org. I want to say that you're going to hear from my esteemed colleagues more about radiation, and I just want to make the point that this is all compounding. Everything I say, they say, has the possibility of being magnified by cumulative exposures, the potential for synergistic outcomes with both other radiation exposures and toxic exposures, all kinds of things in our lives that contribute to greater harm or greater health. We are focusing today on nuclear energy. However, my work is more rooted in nuclear weapons data. But I want to acknowledge this map, which is very recent from the World Nuclear Report.org, and they show that there's 825 sites where reactors either did operate in the past, which means the sites are contaminated forevermore, they are operating now and will be contaminated forevermore, or they are being planned at any of these sites. So go to that website, I'll put it in the chat, to learn about all of these reactor sites worldwide. And Africa is being fingered for the small modular reactors. Oh, and I want to go back because in the United States, the regulations governing radiation are under change right now. And I think the Alliance needs to have an event specifically on that because United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission standards impact the entire world one way or another. I'm not saying they apply worldwide. I'm just saying that because nuclear is so dominant in the United States, we have that biggest stack over there on the left. It will have impacts everywhere when these rules are changed. The proposed rule is due out in May this year, May 19th. So turning to nuclear weapons briefly here. Nuclear weapons and nuclear energy are inextricably linked, both in origin and in continued social investment. Investing in any nation in one is potentially investing in both. Trinity, pictured here, was the first nuclear detonation. There were roughly 15,000 children, women, and men living within 50 miles of the test site. They were not notified, they were not evacuated, and so began the atomic age. We don't make nuclear weapons to kill people with radiation, although that happens. We make nuclear weapons to use the heat and the blast to destroy cities. But I'm using this slide to point out that the radiation itself is a pretty significant portion of the total energy. I'm focusing in my work on the pulse of gamma and neutron that was released at detonation. That's 5%. While fallout, which is a huge matter worldwide, we're all exposed to it, was about 10% of the total energy of the blast. 21 days after Trinity detonation, this photo was taken from the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. It is a mistake to say that this photo is of the bomb. This cloud is what was moments before: buildings, trees, homes, girls, boys, women, and men. And this was the city of Nagasaki. These are inherently discriminate weapons of mass destruction. And speaking as one US citizen, these were crimes against humanity taken by my government in 1945. There have also been over 2,000 detonations labeled as tests. I wish this history has never happened. I am personally very sorry. The 2,000 is worldwide, not all the United States, though we had most. Radiation is invisible, but we can see the damage it has done to these chromosomes. Radiation also rips cell membranes, damages cell organelles, and often results in killing cells or leaving abnormal cells in its wake that can result in disease and death, even from exposures too small to measure. And the international symbol gets it right. It's deadly and you should run. So I'm turning now to the disproportionate impact of radiation on females compared to males. We're going to go through this fairly quickly, but I need to point out that in this graphic, we have 3 generations, if that developing fetus is female. We have the mother, we have the developing fetus, and we have other ova in the mother's ovaries that could be future developing fetuses. And because this one I'm specifying is female, her ova are also present in her developing ovaries. A girl child is born with every ova she will ever have. So radiation exposure during pregnancy has the potential to harm 3 generations immediately as immediate exposure, not heritable or any of those things. So, as Eric said, one of the first indicators of radiation harm from fission, which is splitting atoms, which is what both reactors, nuclear power reactors, and nuclear weapons, they're both fission, which is identical in the kinds of pollution it creates from bombs. We call this fallout. From reactors, it should also be called fallout or radioactive pollution in our environment. And in the first year after the 3 Mile Island accident, Eric Epstein mentioned increased infant mortality. And these are kids already born with children. These aren't pregnancy losses. And this is now in New Mexico around the Trinity area, actually statewide numbers showing that the infant death rate was falling. And then in 1945, after Trinity, it spikes and then goes back to falling. I skipped a point. It's an important point. Dr. Alfred Körblein looked at this in terms of infant death rates in every nuclear weapons owning states during the period of atmospheric nuclear weapons testing, which went up to 1963. And he calculates there may be as many as 3 to 5 million infant deaths that were avoidable if there had been no fallout from atmospheric nuclear weapons testing. And the testing itself has been nuclear colonialism because nearly every test was conducted on the lands of indigenous peoples worldwide. Okay, I'm sure my colleagues are going to talk about cancer. I'm just going to briefly say that radiation damages at our cellular level. We don't get a broken leg or a sore throat except for the fact that radiation impacts cells in our bodies. This is the case of DNA and cancer, where we see that the harm is to DNA. If the cellular repair mechanisms take care of that, great. However, they often either result in cell death, which is safer than an abnormal cell remaining in the body for an indeterminate period of time, but generally cancer is after a latency period. So something triggers that abnormal cell to then grow into a tumor. And this effect can come from a single cell, and therefore extremely low exposures, low amounts of radiation may produce a fatal cancer. Okay, picking up the speed. Could I have a time check? How much time do I have left?
Lisa, are you there? Lisa's.
I failed to start my timer.
Yeah, no, I've got it. You've got 1.5 minutes.
Okay, so here's the thing. I set it all up. These are data from the war crime that I mentioned. It is a war crime to use this data, but this is so important. We already know that children are harmed by radiation more because their cells are dividing and therefore they are at greater risk of DNA harm. The big news in a 60-year study of the people who survived the nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who were then tracked by first government researchers of the United States and now a collaborative between Japan and the United States, studying the health consequences from the detonation of those weapons. That's the exposure that all had in common. There were about 100,000 people who were put into what's called the lifespan study. And the big news is that for every 2 boys who got cancer, cancer definitely occurs in male bodies, in the youngest age group who were tracked for the 60 years. So this is not childhood cancer. This is cancer across the lifespan of children who were exposed in 1945. For every 2 boys who got cancer, 4 girls got cancer. So it is a doubling. And anytime we do research and you get a doubling effect, it's a siren going off. Now, there was also disproportionate impact amongst those in 1945 exposed, really for the first time, to non-natural radiation sources at a huge level. We see that when exposed as adults, not children, for every 2 men who died from cancer, 3 women died of cancer. So this is still across the 60 years. So here's the summation picture of that study. On the bottom are the ages that the people were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 when they were exposed to a huge pulse of gamma and neutron radiation. This is important to nuclear power because we continue to base the information about radiation health outcomes on this data, but only the blue bars, which are the males in each age group, are considered, and indeed, only the blue bars between the ages of 20 and 30 are considered. So in the left-hand side are cancer incidents. And so what we're looking at is the difference between males and females in a scenario in which everybody got the same exposure. Now, that's not historically what happened, but that is what this picture is taking the data from what happened and saying, what if everybody got the same exposure? So we can see that in every age group, female bodies were harmed more, measured as cancer across 60 years, and that the difference between males and females is greatest amongst the young children who were exposed in 1945. And this is not reflected in any radiation standards worldwide, including those that the US is considering changing at the moment. And so I'm going to just jump ahead to the fact that we don't know why, that I do recommend Heidi Hutner's film that we'll put information on, that the US uses a reference man, and we can share the slides so you can get all that fine print, but reference man does not include anything about any children and certainly not anything about any female. So the final point is that radiation regulation based on reference man results in systemic underreporting of radiation harm for the global population. And here's the cover of a report that has all of this cited, is available online, and I'll put the link right now, 2024, by myself and co-author Amanda Nichols. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. That's incredible work. I'm going to see all your accolades there, Mary. I want to next introduce Gordon Edwards from Canada. He's a mathematician, physicist, nuclear consultant, and the president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. He's published articles and reports on radiation standards, radioactive waste, uranium mining, nuclear proliferation, the economics of nuclear power and health implications, and non-nuclear energy strategies. He was featured in our film, The San Onofre Syndrome, Nuclear Power's Legacy, and he is based in Montreal, Canada. Thank you so much for being with us, Gordon.
My pleasure, and thanks for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen and probably have too much to share, but we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to speak generally, and I want to make a distinction between radiation and radioactivity. I prefer to talk about radioactivity in connection with bombs and nuclear reactors. Radiation that we have experience with, for example, is not always ionizing radiation. The word ionizing means that it directly breaks chemical bonds. And if it does that in a cell, in a DNA particular, a DNA molecule, it can make the cell grow in an incorrect fashion because it damages the genetic instructions. And that's how cancer develops, and that's how mutations occur, and many other illnesses associated with radiation exposure as well, what we call radiation exposure. The nuclear industry likes to tell us that we have background radiation. It's nothing to be afraid of. It's been there ever since creation. What they don't tell you is that they are creating hundreds of varieties of new radioactive materials that were never found in nature before 1940. And these have different patterns, different pathways through the environment and through the human body. Now, in 1895, X-rays were discovered. This is a temporary penetrating radiation given off from a device called cathode ray tubes. When the X-ray machine is turned off, it's harmless. It's only a temporary exposure, but it can cause radiation burns, it can cause cancer, it can cause a lot of harm, but it's a temporary phenomenon. If all the X-ray machines were shut off tomorrow, there'd be no actual residue from that. Radioactivity is different. It was first discovered in 1896 by Henri Becquerel, and Becquerel is used now for the unit of radioactivity. And he discovered that penetrating radiation is given off by rocks, ores of uranium and thorium, and it cannot be shut off, unlike an X-ray machine or most other forms of radiation that we're familiar with. Here we have one of those rocks in a cloud chamber, so we can see the tracks of the enormous energy that is being given off by this uranium ore 7 days a week. And this has been going on for millions and millions and millions of years. And nobody knows how to speed it up or slow it down or shut it off. It just happens and happens and happens. Now, if one tiny particle of that rock were in your body, then the same thing would be happening in your body in miniature, because we don't know how to shut it off once it gets in the body. We don't know how to shut it off when it's outside the body. So what we're talking about here are material things. These are not invisible rays, but material particles that are radioactive. And it means their nuclei of the atoms, the nucleus, is unstable. And it's like a little time bomb. It's going to disintegrate suddenly and violently without any warning. And when it does, it gives off a kind of a subatomic shrapnel that we call atomic radiation. But actually, some of the things, shrapnel is actually particulate. They're particles, alpha particles and beta particles. They don't have a long track the way X-rays would have or gamma rays. They are shorter, and they can be very damaging when inside the body. Now, alpha particles cannot penetrate even a sheet of paper, but inside the body, there's no protection. And the alpha emitters are among the most dangerous of all the radioactive materials internally. Beta emitters also do a lot of damage internally. Gamma rays have much more penetrating power, but strangely enough, that makes them, relatively speaking, less hazardous than much beta and alpha radiation, because it goes right through and only part of the energy is delivered to the cells. Whereas in the case of alpha and beta, almost the entire energy is delivered directly to the cells. Here's an example, a particle of plutonium, a particulate, a speck of plutonium in the lung tissue of an ape. This is through a microscope, and it was photographed for 48 hours. And those spiky lines are actually the tracks of alpha particles being given off. You notice they don't go very far, but they influence 50,000 cells. And if one of those cells is destabilized in such a way that it's able to reproduce, it can turn into a full-blown lung cancer, perhaps 20, 30, 40 years later. It doesn't happen overnight. There's what's called a latency period for these things to develop. Marie Curie discovered that there are other radioactive materials in the same rock where the uranium came from, and that's because when a uranium atom disintegrates, it doesn't disappear. It changes into another element, which is also radioactive. And then that changes into another element. And in this way, she discovered several of these. She discovered two that she called radium and polonium. And one of her students discovered that the radium also gives off a gas, a radioactive gas called radon gas. all of these materials started off as uranium atoms. And uranium turns out to be the key element in fission technology as well. But this was long before fission was discovered, which was not until 43 years later. Now, these young girls, back in the 1920s, they were hired to paint dials of watches and other instruments with a radium-based paint to make them glow in the dark. And many of these girls died from fatal anemia. Many of them died from bone cancers and later from head cancers, with very minute amounts of radium ingested into their bodies. The maximum amount of radiation in any girl's body was only 18 micrograms of radium. That's an amazingly small amount that really, if such an amount at that time under chemical procedures would not be even detectable. And yet it was able to make all the bones in their body radioactive and cause death. Uranium miners in the Navajo community who were non-smokers developed an excess of lung cancer, which was clearly due to their underground work in mining uranium. And it was through the inhalation of this radioactive gas, radon gas, which still kills about 20 to 30,000 Americans every year just due to breathing radon in their homes, not occupational exposure, domestic exposure. Here's a man, Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned with polonium-210, a tiny amount. The Los Alamos laboratory says polonium-210 is incredibly 250 billion times more toxic than cyanide. That's an incredible thought. That means that if you had an amount of polonium-210 equivalent to a deadly amount of cyanide, you could kill 250 billion more people than the cyanide would kill. It's almost incomprehensible to think about that, but it's important to realize how very, very tiny amounts can be extremely dangerous. And that's because the nucleus of the atom, one of the smallest things we can imagine, has the greatest force in the universe in it, which is the nuclear force. And it's the unleashing of that nuclear force, which is almost incomprehensible, what tiny amounts can cause such great harm. This is a wall of uranium tailings. These are the leftovers, radioactive leftovers from uranium mining, because you know what? They discard all the other radioactive products in the uranium tailings and leave it behind as waste. And that contains all the radium, all the polonium, all the radon, and all the other radioactive byproducts of uranium. 85% of the radioactivity is left in that radioactive sand, and it has an effective half-life of 76,000 years. That means that the amounts of those materials will not diminish by half until 76,000 years have passed. Now, in 1938-39, they discovered that another property of uranium is there was a trigger called the neutron that can release an enormous amount of this nuclear energy all at once. And that's because of a chain reaction. When a neutron strikes a particular type of uranium atom, it splits it into two other atoms, which are fiercely radioactive. They're called fission products. These are new atoms that were never found in nature before. And it also gives off more neutrons. Those more neutrons not only keep the chain reaction going and allow for an enormous release of energy, but also multiply the production of man-made, human-made radioactive byproducts, hundreds and hundreds of them. Here's a man, Barney Hannibal Paulson, who cleaned up after a nuclear accident at Chalk River, Ontario, where a piece of uranium fuel, spent uranium fuel, caught fire and burned, spreading material into the air. Now, he wore a completely protective suit when he worked, but he had to take that suit off. And when you take the suit off, you can contaminate yourself if you're not careful. And if you're contaminated, then you carry it with you home. And so he had particles lodged in his hair follicles and in the pores of his body that caused him over 200 cancer operations 20 years later. So that's what happens with the radioactive materials. You become the internal, it's as if you have incorporated internal X-ray machines into your body. Of course, radionuclides are chemical substances. They're actually materials that give off this radiation. And for example, iodine-131 has a particular chemical formulation that goes to the thyroid gland, and that causes thyroid cancers. Cesium-137 goes to the soft tissues and makes meat unfit as food. Strontium 90 behaves like calcium. It goes to the bones, the teeth, and mother's milk. And I want to emphasize here that iodine and cesium and strontium are non-radioactive materials in our environment. They're not radioactive. But what the nuclear reactor does is it creates radioactive varieties of these non-radioactive elements. And that's why radioactive waste have to be kept out of the environment of living things. Because once the non-radioactive materials are contaminated with the radioactive materials, you can't separate them anymore. And so you become, you're making the whole world more unhealthy for generations to come.
Gordon, that's time, just so you know.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up then. I just want to mention the longevity of the nuclear waste. Here are some fission products that are very long-lived, hundreds of thousands of years, even millions of years. And that's why radioactive waste, since the radioactivity cannot be shut off, it becomes a permanent health problem for countless generations to come. Thank you. I'm just going to stop here.
Thank you so much. That was incredible, Gordon. And yes, it's so amazing that this death industry continues. I'm now going to introduce Dr. Fairlie. I hope you're seeing all the applause for your presentation, Gordon. Okay. Dr. Ian Fairlie is a UK-based Canadian consultant on radiation in the environment, and he's former member of the three-person secretariat to Britain's committee examining the radiation risks of internal emitters, SERI. He is a radiation biologist, and he is focused on the radiological hazards of nuclear fuel. His areas of interest are radiation doses and risks arising from releases, the radioactive releases at nuclear facilities. He's based in London, England. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you very much, Mary Beth. It's very kind of you. I'm going to put up some a few PowerPoint slides if I can get this to work properly. Tell me if you've got them. Can you see them?
Yes.
Yes.
The first thing, my first slide that I'm going to show is a slide published in the BMJ a couple of years ago. The author is David Richardson, who I'm very glad to see is one of the participants. I'm not sure that the screen is big enough. Tell me what here we go, slide slow from the current slide. You're right. Can people see this?
Yes.
Perfect.
This is the best evidence that we've got from very good epidemiology studies called the UNWORK studies. It's occupational health here involved. And on the x-axis is the cumulative dose in millisieverts, and the y-axis is their relative risk. And you can see, by the way, this is from a huge study, over 300,000 participants in Britain, France, Canada, and United States, I believe. And so basically, this is the bee's knees as far as epidemiological evidence. It's the latest evidence, and I thank David Richardson for the amount of work that was done on this. Now, the interesting thing about it is that this slide shows, first of all, that the dose-risk relationship is linear. But the key thing I would point out to you is if you look at the low dose area, about below, say, 200 millisieverts, that the risks actually are, if anything, higher than over the whole range. So this is a cause for concern. It shows that those people who say that low doses means we shouldn't worry about, well, they're wrong, basically, because this is powerful evidence showing that the risks exist all the way down to zero here, that it's very good evidence that the risks are real. Now, I'm going to go on to my next slide. I've recently published a book called The Dangers of Ionizing Radiation. And you can look it up yourself on the web. And it's about 270 pages long. And I don't expect people to read this. So I've condensed it down to a couple of slides in a nutshell. The first is that, well, radiation is mutagenic, of course, is carcinogenic, is teratogenic. All exposures to radiation carry some risk. That means there's no real safe dose of radiation. No matter how low you go, there's always some risk. And of course, at very, very low doses, you have low risk. All radiation exposures are additive. They don't die away. They stay with you. You have to add up the risks over your lifetime. Fourthly, that cancers arise from a mutation to a single stem cell. And that gives you an idea that no matter how, even one cell, if it's mutated, it gives rise to cancer. The next is that the latency period, often people think you have to wait for the latency period, and then after that, there's no more danger. Well, that's not true. The latency period is merely the time for cancers to first appear. Other cancers will appear afterwards. The next point is that F is that background radiation itself is dangerous. And in my book, I show calculations showing that it may account for up to half of spontaneous childhood leukemias. In other words, the reason why we have childhood leukemias is mostly because of background radiation. The next point is that 40 years of background radiation to women's eggs is why they're recommended to have their babies before they reach 40. Why? Because their lifetime supply of egg cells is in the baby girls' bodies when they're born. And they, of course, they have background radiation, so many of them, of their egg cells are killed off, and others are in not a very good state. H is the point that internal radiation, the kind that Gordon was talking about from inhaled or ingested radioactivity, is more dangerous than external radiation, and it's poorly characterized by our radiation protection laws and agencies. So that's one. The next slide shows the second half. Well, this is more detailed. I'm afraid that you're going to have to read the book if you want to find out a little bit more about this. Radiation has epigenetic effects as well as genetic effects. Epigenetic, well, that is the, how to say, the non-gene effects of radiation. Just as an aside, many of you will have heard of the phrase junk DNA. That's the DNA which doesn't code for proteins. And people used to think that was junk. Well, of course, that's crazy. Our DNA has been very carefully maintained over millennia. And so the body doesn't preserve junk DNA. The DNA does have important information in it. It's epigenetic information. In addition to, the next point is that the DNA has non-targeted effects. In other words, what does that mean? It means effects not on DNA itself. And these include genomic instability, bystander effects, and mini-satellite mutations, and apoptosis. The next point, you may think that I'm rabbiting on here, but radiation has a lot of effects, and So I'm going to just, this is a nutshell. The next point is fatal cancer risks are underestimated by the fact that the ICRP applies a DREF, which deliberately lowers the risks of radiation by a factor of 2. They shouldn't do this, of course, but they do. As Mary herself has pointed out, that the radiation risks of women are roughly twice as great in women as are in men. And also she showed that radiation risks in children are a factor of 10 times greater than in adults. Going on, a small radiation dose to a pregnant woman would increase her chances of having a leukemic child by a factor of about 60%. 1.6-fold. Radiation exposures from nuclear facilities double the risks in children living nearby. And I just want to dwell on that for a second. All of us know that not only in Europe, but also in the United States and Canada, the authorities are planning big expansions in their nuclear programs. But the reality of the matter is that people who live near nuclear facilities, no matter what kind of nuclear facilities, small ones, large ones, whatever, they have increased risks of leukemia and other cancers. Now, the evidence for this is contained in my book, a recent book called The Dangers of Ionizing Radiation, in a separate chapter, chapter 13. And I hope that people will get the book and to read the chapter on the increased risks of living near reactors. By my calculation, there are over 86 studies worldwide which show these increases. I'll repeat that. There are now at least 86 studies worldwide showing increased risks of cancers in people who live near nuclear reactors. The problem is, of course, is that institutions which recommend radiation standards have very close links to the nuclear industry. Look, I'll finish there and advise you to try and get my book. May I mention to you that the book is very expensive. The hardback version is over 120 bucks. However, the paperback version, which will come out in the summer, is more like about 50 bucks. And there'll be an electronic version about the same price. I'm sorry about these costs. I don't have any control over them. The thing is that the book is out now, and it poses very uncomfortable questions for the governments in the United States, Britain, and Canada, who are planning big expansions in their nuclear programs. The evidence shows that there are real dangers to the radiation's exposures there nearby. Thanks very much. I will sign off there.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Fairlie. And I see your co-author, Cindy Folkers, has a question in the chat for you. She said, have you compiled these studies in a single place?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Are you saying there's a question that you want me to answer? I didn't.
Yes, yes. This is a
And
question.
the question is,
The Cindy, your co-author in the book for the book,
yeah,
is
one of the books, yes.
right, one of the books, is asking, have you compiled these studies that you were referring to in a single place?
No, I haven't. There is a reason for that, is that these have been compiled by other authors. What I've done is I've looked at the various authors and added up the studies that they cite, and the number that they have is over 86 at the current date. It used to be 40, then it went up to over 60, now it's 86. I mean, the main point that I'm getting across here is that these are studies by independent authors who themselves have collected this evidence together. All I've done is saying, well, look, there's the evidence. And it's the authors that I've cited are in my book, the latest book, The Dangers of Ionizing Radiation. So if you go to the book and look at chapter 13, it is, you will see the citations there, quite clear.
Okay, great. Thank you. Cindy, I hope you can put into the chat the title of the book and the publishers so we can make sure people have it. I've already read it and I don't remember paying
Mary
$50.
Beth, there
Yes.
are two books I want to clarify. Ian just did an academic book written by himself, which is out now, which is new.
Oh,
And he and I collaborated on an earlier book. I recommend everybody read both of them if you haven't. The earlier book was more focused on the radiation scientists and how they had really horrible repercussions for when they determined that radiation was more dangerous than the government and industry entities wanted to believe. So there's two different books. They have two different focuses or foci, I suppose is how you say that. But yeah, everybody should get Ian's new book as well, which is different. So just
okay.
a point of clarification. Hi,
Thank-
Ian.
Thank you so much.
Mary Beth, if I may, we can now invite everybody to, we can invite you now to start addressing the questions.
Right, that's what I'm doing.
Great. Okay. Terrific.
Okay, and we have a question, another question for Ian from John LaForge. Hi,
Or-
John. He wants to know what
Okay,
are the
I'll tell you, okay.
what
Can
are DDREFs? What does that stand for?
Okay, can you hear me? I
Yes.
don't know.
Yes.
You can hear me, right. DDREF, sorry, John, it's an acronym meaning dose and dose rate reduction effectiveness factor. Basically, it's a long story, and it's outrageous. The ICRP has looked at cell evidence from the 1940s and 50s, which showed that if you give radiation in small doses rather than in a big dose, it shows that the effects are lower. However, if you look at the epidemiological evidence, i.e., human evidence, not cell evidence, human evidence, it's the other way around. That in fact, if you give small doses, you have greater effects. Now, I understand that the ICRP are, which stands for International Commission on Radiological Protection, basically a trade association for radiation, is now looking at this, but they're dragging their heels because they're going to have to get rid of it. And when you do that, then immediately the fatal cancer risks are automatically doubled. So that's what I used the acronym because, well, it's it's something that you just learn to use when you're working on the matter. But that's what it means, John. And by the way, can I give you a shout out? Because a few years back, this is John Lafarge, you said that the nuclear industry has two main problems. One is money, and the second is tritium. I totally agree. Well done. It's a very good way of looking at the two problems. So hats off to you for that.
Thank you so much. And I'd love to do a focus on tritium sometime. It's so Dr. Edwards, you have your hand up. Oh, you're muted. Okay.
I just wanted to mention to people that there's a big difference between what are called prompt effects and delayed effects. Prompt effects, for example, if you give a certain dose of radiation to people, it'll just kill them outright. Now, you can stagger that dose over a period of time where it will not kill them. It may cause radiation sickness, hair loss, and that sort of thing, but it won't kill them. But that's different with delayed effects. With delayed effects, spacing out the dose over time doesn't help. In fact, as Ian said, it could make things worse. So the induction of cancer is caused by damage to individual cells. And that is not helped by fractionating it out. It simply delays the damage that's done to those cells, but it's going to take time for them to develop into cancers anyway. And so when you follow them through over decades, you find out that that doesn't help at all. In fact, it could make things worse.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Beth, can I say something?
Sure.
Because I'm going to have to go very soon. But I'd like to congratulate yourself and the organizers of this because you've had over 100 participants throughout the session, which is great. Well done. So kudos to you and also to everybody who is organizing this. I think it's a great example of how shall I say transatlantic understanding. So well done, okay? Well done.
Thank you. Thank you. We're delighted about it. I can't help but think that this is going to be really useful for us to be in solidarity and sharing more and more information. Thank you. Thank you. And I wanted to ask two more. Well, these have been addressed in the chat already, but if you would like to hear the other two questions, one is that there's the International Agency for Research on Cancer is saying, the IARC, that examination for thyroid cancers is more of a risk than than actually it's riskier to do that. That is providing an impetus for ill ease or something. And so we'd like one of you to comment on that, please.
Sorry, I didn't quite get what you want me to comment on. I'm sorry.
That the IARC is saying that testing for thyroid cancer is a problem that's worse than the probable disease rate.
After a major reactor accident, this would be Fukushima in particular.
Oh, right. Well, I haven't actually seen IARC say that, so I'm a bit hesitant to actually comment on something that I haven't seen. It's true that increased screening does pick up a lot of different kinds of cancer, of thyroid cancer, but that doesn't obviate the fact that at Fukushima, that there is definitely an increased rate of thyroid cancer among the local population. That's without any doubt occurring whatsoever. The authorities blame it on increased surveillance. Well, that is just a smokescreen, in my view.
Okay, thank you very much. And Gordon, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I just want to add that people should bear in mind, we know very well the pharmaceutical industry, how well they are at covering up things like the harmful effects, even the addictive nature of opioids, for example, was suppressed. And similarly, the tobacco industry, as you know, has fought tooth and nail to cover up the dangers of cigarette smoke. Well, something similar happens in the nuclear industry, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the people giving out these lies or misinformations or distortions, they don't always know they're lying because they don't know the truth. And so they're giving out false information according to what they think is true, but it's really a propaganda line that has been coined by the higher ups. And a lot of these things, it is true that there are difficulties in really assessing these things accurately. No doubt about it. And it is true that if you look for more thyroid cancers, you're going to find more thyroid cancers. And so this will somewhat inflate the numbers. But that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of thyroid cancers that are caused by radiation. Over 5,000 to 6,000 children had to have their thyroid glands surgically removed in Belarus because of radioactive iodine from the Chernobyl accident. And there's no doubt about that.
Thank you. Thank you. Mary?
Gordon just said what I raised my hand to say, but I'm going to say it again. Chernobyl resulted in very well documented and acknowledged like 6,000% increase in childhood with thyroid cancer. And that does not reflect adult thyroid cancer, which was also caused by both Chernobyl and Fukushima and magically disappears from the conversation. So you have to understand that the nuclear industry, when it comes to radiation and its regulators, are like a magician on a stage, and they're distracting you with a girl with few clothing or a dove or a big burst of glitter or whatever. It's all there to distract from the fact that there is no safe level of radiation exposure. Every exposure from the industry is on top of natural radiation levels, whether which are diverse across the planet. So no matter what your background level is, additional exposures from these facilities are on top. They are avoidable, and therefore the diseases that result from these avoidable exposures are also avoidable. In other words, if we solve our energy and security problems with something besides fission, like fission, fusion of the sun, solar energy, or the movement of our atmosphere, wind energy, or any of the other non-fission sources, we will not have these diseases because we won't have these exposures. It doesn't solve the history, but we have choices as human beings where we go from here forward.
Thank you so much, Mary. I just want to insert that from my understanding of Dr. Bendichevsky's work, who focused on children who were made ill and died after Chernobyl, that what the amount of radioactivity that caused them severe organ breakdown and death was increasingly smaller to cause that, because they had already experienced through their parents exposures from the accidents in Russia and so on. So that dispersed radioactive pollution. It's a very interesting point that your body is weakened so that less and less radioactivity can cause more and more damage. Gordon?
Yeah, I wanted to say, going back to the 3 Mile Island situation, I remember reading a document that looked at there were massive bird deaths at 3 Mile Island. There were also massive effects on animals, farm animals, and there were miscarriages of farm animals. There were abnormalities and so on. Now, there was a report from the U.S. government, which I had through my friend Robert Del Tredici. And I went through it, and they investigated every single one of these incidents, the bird deaths, the false, and in every single case, their verdict was the same. They said, this is a legitimate case. It truly happened. And yes, it could have been caused by radiation, but it wasn't caused by radiation. And the reason it wasn't caused by radiation is because there was not enough radiation given off to cause these effects. Okay, now, I went to a man whom I happen to know, who was the Rasmussen, Norman Rasmussen, who was the head of the nuclear physics department at MIT, and who wrote the reactor safety volume, 8-volume study on reactor safety. And I asked him, not long after the 3 Mile Island accident, Dr. Rasmussen, what was the extent of the emissions from 3 Mile Island? He said, we have no idea, because the radiation monitors were off scale from the first day onwards. And so it's your guess is as good as mine as to how much radiation was given off. Now, what's happening here is that the fundamental philosophy of science is being stood on its head. In science, what you're supposed to do is have a hypothesis, and then you test that hypothesis with data. And if the data says the hypothesis is wrong, you don't throw out the data. You change the hypothesis. And what we have here is time and time again, the nuclear industry is using hypothetical. They don't know what the radiation exposures of people were. They used their hypothesis of what people were exposed to discredit the data. And that's absolutely unscientific.
Thank you.
In fact, it's anti-scientific.
Right. Eric.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So Robert's book was really good. We had him down a couple of years ago. I believe he's a fellow Canadian. But early on, we had the head veterinarian for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania confirm, just the increased number of cancers and stillbirth, and other impacts to the farm animals. And what's interesting, this is a pretty rural community to the south and to the east. Also, you have animals that probably weren't checked because of they're Amish or Old Order Mennonite and aren't going to report them. But I did interview, I can't think of the guy's name, the head veterinarian. And he just said there was overwhelming evidence that they had increased cancer among their animals. And those folks, when you go out to the farms and talk to them, they're not going to lie. They're going to tell you what happened. And I know when Robert covered some of it, but I'll see if I can dig out Dr. Weber's report. A lot of it was anecdotal and share it with folks. But it was pretty powerful. And then after that, our chicken flocks were wiped out by avian flu. I'm not saying there's a connection, but huge hit for the agricultural community.
Well, isn't it true, Mary and Ian and Gordon, that the immune system is affected, so
yeah.
that you would have less of a defense against avian flu? I think that's also very suspicious with the die-off of the starfish after Fukushima. Eric, or do you want to say something? Or you put
No. I'll see if I can dig out Dr. Weber's
Okay.
information. And,
Put your
sorry.
hand. Okay, Gordon.
It's been well known that the leukocytes and the white blood cells and the other agents of the body that fight infectious diseases in particular are compromised very early on. You don't have to wait years for this. This happens right away. Even low-level radiation exposure will compromise the leukocytes and consequently compromise the immune system. So people are much more prone to getting any kind of communicable disease. And that's another fact. Now that's a lot harder to quantify, but this is something that Rosalie Bertel spent a great deal of her career cancer and genetic effects are the strongest ones that have solid evidence to support it. And consequently, even the industry has difficulty in denying it, although they still deny it. But they have difficulty denying it because there's damn good evidence. But there's also a lot of evidence of cardiovascular effects, heart attacks and strokes. There's also a lot of evidence of mental retardation. This is absolutely determined from the Hiroshima survivors and the Nagasaki survivors that they found that the intelligence of the children born who were exposed in utero was definitely affected. And it's numerical. It's in the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation. And there's no evidence of a threshold for it either. So there are lots of other effects which are quite disturbing and which are not as well documented, you might say, in numerical terms.
I thought I had read a study that the brain size after all the above ground testing actually shrank, and the SAT scores plummeted, the scholastic aptitude tests that kids take at the end of high school.
That's absolutely correct. And that was not only for the Hiroshima. You're right about the brain size shrinking. The actual skull size decreased, microcephaly it's called. But they also found this for children who were irradiated, their scalps were irradiated medically for ringworm. They found that similar effect obtained there too. So it's you can't just pin it on the atomic bomb.
Right, right. Eric, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, just one. I forgot to add that Mary Osborne, who had died a couple of years ago, had extensive documentation of mutations with plants, and we were able to get her work entered into. Well, I don't know if it's been displayed yet. It's at the Smithsonian, which was, I think, a pretty significant development. But if you go to our website, there is a link to the mutated plants, flowers that she documented over probably about 40 years.
Thank you. Yeah, I was so impressed by that. Um, okay, so I wanted to say to everybody that we intend to put, if they're not already in the chat, we're going to be sending out the information for all of our speakers that they will be how to contact their body of work to see their websites, any more studies that they want to add, and of course the links to the films. And Stephen Sondheim, do you have a quick question? We're about out of time.
I have a question.
I do. I do have a question, and it's for the scientists. The nuclear industry is saying that there's no causality, causality can't be proven from all these studies. They say it's just correlation. And that frustrates me because obviously there are effects. So can you scientists talk about how we could address that? We know it's causative, but it's difficult to illustrate that. Thank you.
One of the problems, if I could explain in answer to Stephen there, is that you see, when we come to uranium miners, we can calculate fairly accurately what their exposure was to radon gas by the time they spent in the mine and the measurement of the concentrations of the radon in the mine. We can also do that with other atomic workers by using their work history. But in fact, we don't, and smokers, cigarette smokers, we can tell how many cigarettes a day they smoked or how many packages a week they smoked and for how many years. So we can estimate the dose. You have to be able to estimate the dose as well as the results in order to get a strong causality. And what we're lacking is we don't know what these people in the general public are actually being exposed to because the industry is only guessing. They really don't know what people are being exposed to. They don't know what they're ingesting, what they're breathing into their lungs, and so on. And so that's why we have these correlations that can't be used to establish causality. It's because we don't exactly know what, in fact, individual radiation doses these people got. And so we use distance from the nuclear power plant as a surrogate for dosage. And those surrogates work quite well, and they show us a definite increase in cancer. But to establish causality, the industry, just like the tobacco industry of old, is trying to fight tooth and nail to make it more and more difficult and to make it as obscure and mystify the subject matter.
Thank
rather
you.
than clarify it.
Thanks, Gordon. And I'm going to call on Mary and then Roy after Mary.
I get frustrated because it seems like we have to prove every time somebody is sick something we can't prove, which is whether radiation caused that particular illness or not. But nobody can prove that a particular illness was not caused by radiation. So then we turn to the quality of the work done in large groups of people where the reconstruction of the exposure was done for the A-bomb survivors and for the nuclear workers, the in-work study that we saw from Dr. Ian Fairlie. Both of these very, very large groups of people have dose reconstruction, and they also have control groups of similar people who have similar lifestyles, similar ages, blah, 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 to be the control that did not have any workplace or A-bomb exposure, okay? And then we talk about excess cancers. That's comparing the group that was impacted by the A-bomb detonation or by exposures in the nuclear industry as workers, to the control people who are part of the study but don't have any exposures. And so we can't prove which cancers in the study group were caused by their work or by being bombed by the United States in 1945. We can't prove which cancers were what you'd expect or not similar to the control group, but we can say categorically that there are excess cancers in those groups. And because they're so big, and the one thing they all have in common is that radiation exposure that's being studied, we do have causal relation between radiation exposure and at least cancer, which sadly is the only outcome studied by those two large efforts. But cancer is taken then as a flag or an indicator for all the other health consequences that we enumerate, because it would be a crime to only talk about cancer when we are discovering that all these other things, including heart attack and stroke, have a dose response basis in studies that are peer reviewed and are in the literature. We do not have to prove that cancer is caused by radiation over and over. It is.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. And okay, Christopher Roy.
Okay, yes. Okay, my question is for Gordon and for Eric Epstein. I want to know what steps are nuclear power plants in the North American and international countries doing to dispose of their nuclear waste without harming the natural environment that all the radiation damage is causing to animals and crops. How are they disposing of that nuclear waste without harming the natural environment?
I mean, our perspective, look, we have a settlement agreement with Constellation, so we monitor maybe 7 nuclear power plant decommissioning funds. I don't think I've never found any utility that's doing any research on disposing of waste. See a lot of them generating more waste, but you can tell that there's no confidence based on their economics when they think they're planning to remove the waste off the site. I would say this, Christopher, and it's interesting because at TMI-1, we have a lot of waste. We filled up one spent fuel, well, one ISOFI. We're going to build another one. Then TMI-2 is going to build another one. So I don't think the waste is going to go anywhere. And I also think that the companies are incentivized to keep the waste there. So at TMI, like all the other utilities, is that they get paid by the Department of Energy every year to keep the waste on site. So TMI-1, TMI-2 on the river, Peach Bottom 1, 2, and 3, Susquehanna 1 and 2, all have spent fuel facilities, but there is absolutely no, any litigation I've done, there's been no indication that the companies are actively seeking a resolution. And why should they? By doing nothing, they make money. If you sit and do nothing, you're going to get reimbursed to maintain the waste on site. So I would hate to say that I don't see much progress. I think we're going the wrong way. Actually, maybe that'll change over time. But final point, we have a small reactor down at Peach Bottom 1, about a 70 megawatt reactor, operated 67 to 73, gas cooled reactor. When we interrogated them on, what are you going to do with the waste? We said we're waiting for research from Europe. That was literally the response. Fort St. Vrains is somewhat similar, but the waste is going nowhere, Christopher. I mean, I can't think of a worse place to store waste on an island in a river that floods, that empties into the Chesapeake Bay. But they're making money doing nothing.
Thanks, Eric. Maybe the waste dump at San Onofre is another really bad example, right next to the rising ocean and in a tsunami zone. Okay, let's see. Do we want to take a couple of more questions? Can people stay a little longer? Or I think we had allocated an hour and a half, but we're happy to stay as long as people are interested. And so, Gordon, did you want to say something about the waste issue?
Well, I just wanted to say that the word disposal has no scientific definition. It's a completely unscientific term. There is no, we do not have, and there's no principle of science that allows us to say that these things are going to stay where we put it for 1 million years and more. There's really no scientific principle that can be used because the models that are used to project these things are useless if you cannot test them. And how can you test them over that period of time? So the result is these models are nothing but unproven hypotheses. And once again, we're accepting the hypothesis in place of data. So we're using the hypothesis as a substitute for data. That's completely unscientific. The other thing, however, that I want to point out is that this is really a dodge on the part of the industry to prevent themselves from being completely shut down. Back around the mid 70s, for the first 30 years of the nuclear age, they never told anybody there was such a thing as nuclear waste. They said nuclear power is a clean technology, which implies no waste, no problem. So it was only after the plants were built and the waste was produced that the problem became apparent to the decision makers. And they were fooled by the industry into saying, oh, we do have a solution. We're just going to bury it underground and it'll stay there forever and never bother anybody. And in fact, that solution is nothing but an idle dream, because if you keep on producing waste at the surface, you'll never solve the problem. It can't possibly be buried for at least 30 or 40 years. And that means you'll always have 30 or 40 years worth of waste at the surface. And the surface is no safer than it was before they actually built their underground repository. So the concept of the underground repository doesn't even make sense if you're going to have a continuing nuclear power industry.
Thanks, Gordon. Dennis Nelson has his hand up. Do you have a question, Dennis? You're on mute. You want to unmute yourself? Okay, maybe he stepped away. Suzanne, you have.
Hello, I'm speaking from Norway. I have a question. Is anybody working on the problem connected to the shift of fuel rods? As far as I know, 1/3 has to be replaced every year, and this procedure is releasing radioactivity to the environment. Children and women could be protected by being advised to stay at home for 3 or 4 days around this shift in the perimeter of 5 kilometers around a nuclear power plant. But this is not done because the owners of the nuclear power plants do not want to raise awareness about the risks of radiation. But it would be an easy thing to protect the population.
Oh.
Yes.
It would indeed increase protection to stay at home, but I want to bring out something that we discovered in part because of information from Dr. Alfred Korblein in Germany, which
Christopher, can you please mute yourself?
which showed some data from a nuclear reactor site that verifies what Suzanne has just said, that there's massive releases because there's no containment during every stage of refueling. And so it's vapors with massive tritium, it's noble gases, and there are also volatile fission products that are released. And so the industry hires people to do calculations to avoid this plume of vapors that is very low because it's at the site, just at the top of the roof, it just comes out. And so it's not high atmospheric like a nuclear weapons test. It's very local and low. So they do meteorological analysis so that plume won't go towards a population center to a city to reduce exposures. Well, all well and good, except for it goes somewhere. And so where it goes is typically rural areas. And as she said, they are not notified. And so there's this big mystery about why there are cancer clusters and leukemia clusters around reactors. It's not a mystery at all. this is a plume. It's being sent to a low population area where then these clusters appear later as if they're unconnected to the fact that they were specifically targeted for this release. And so the fact that the left hand and the right hand don't know how to look at, months or even a few years for the outcomes of these decisions, and then they deny them, is all taken together part of why they won't warn you, because they don't want to acknowledge that they're specifically targeting anyone, but they are. And so reactor refueling should be announced to every community on all sides of a reactor, and people should be aware of these dangers, and we should phase out nuclear power.
Thank you, Mary. I just want to add also the batch releases into the body of water that's adjacent to the plants is also a concern. And our San Onofre in California, the people at Surfrider actually got the utility to agree to announce the batch release into the ocean. This not the atmosphere, but the batch releases that happen into the ocean 48 hours in advance. And I encourage all of you who are working next to a reactor to push for that at least. I mean, they've set the precedent at San Onofre. Gordon, do you want to say something? Oh, you're muted, Gordon.
Every CANDU reactor gives off into the atmosphere and into the water every year over 100 trillion becquerels of tritium and 100 billion becquerels of carbon-14. Now, carbon-14 is similar to tritium in several ways. They're both low beta emitters and therefore hard to detect, except that carbon-14 has a 5,700-year half-life, and so it accumulates in the environment even more so than tritium. When you give off tritium into the environment, it has a 12-year half-life, so it's around for decades, even centuries. When you give off carbon-14, it's around for millennia, for longer than the human race, in fact, or human history at least. So we're not only talking about tritium. Those noble gases that we referred to earlier, they have a relatively short half-life, but they give a high dose of gamma as they pass overhead. It's called skyshine. They even have a name for it. The other materials, such as carbon and hydrogen are basic building blocks of all organic molecules. And radioactive carbon and radioactive hydrogen, carbon-14 and tritium, can enter into organic molecules in our own bodies quite easily. It's called organically bound tritium and organically bound carbon. And so these are particularly strategically placed in the cells of our body when we're exposed to them in the environment. So yes, it's good to have notice of emissions that are going on. In fact, we're asking for online notice of emissions constantly. How much emissions are going on hour by hour? It should be automatic, just like temperatures are automatic. The reason they don't want to do it is because they are coasting on a lie that nuclear power is clean. Anything they admit about biological effects or releases is going to contradict their lie, which is that nuclear power is a clean technology, which is not. So it's all based on a lie. And in fact, they bend science to support the lie rather than vice versa.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Gordon. That's so true.
Mary Beth, if I might just chime in for a moment, everybody, that was a brilliant sharing, Gordon, just now. I want to remind everybody we are going to be uploading this entire video on YouTube, and I want to encourage everybody to comment on that YouTube video when it's up. That engagement will help bring it up to more people's eyes, and it will also help our conversation to keep going.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, so I think we probably should be respectful of everybody's time. It's now we've gone over, and I so appreciate everybody's attendance. I want you to know I don't think we ever said I'm the director of the Ecological Options Network, and Lisa and Maria and Morgan are all on our team. And we are so excited about the future of these webinars. And thank you so much for your interest. And we'll be getting in touch with everybody. And Lisa, you're saving the chat, right?
Yes, we'll save the chat, we'll share the recording, and I believe each of the speakers has offered to share their presentations or at least to share information. And we have shared URLs to all of their organizations as well.
Mary Beth and Lisa, thanks, and everybody else for pulling this off. It's a lot of work.
Thank you. Thank you.
I know I'm a prima donna.
Thank you to all for participating. And
Right.
I think Ian said at one point we were well over 100 people. And I really hope that we can spread this information far and wide.
I
And
think actually we had 119 was the peak.
and 180 reserved. So we're going to be spreading more than that. So thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Let's get this party started.
Bye-bye.
Bye.